Hopefully.
Well, there's a bottom.
I think if Eric can be here, well, we'll.
Yeah, right.
That was welcome everybody to our Jefferson Township Republican Organization meeting. I'm Rich McGee, the committee man for Jefferson Township, and Frida Keogh, who just stood up right on cue, is the committee woman. And we've got a nice full program for you this evening, but for anybody new this evening, just want to explain a little bit about what we're about. We're the official arm of the Republican Party in Jefferson Township, Missouri Republican Party in Jefferson Township. And there are 26 townships that make up St. Louis County, and each township has a committee man, committee woman, and they meet on a monthly basis in something called Central Committee, and they act as the official arm of the Missouri Republican Party at the county level. And the idea of a committee man and committee woman at townships goes back to the days of Abraham Lincoln, when you would go out in your wards or townships and identify Republicans, potential Republican voters, supporters, as well as candidates. And so this is a way of identifying Republicans in Jefferson Township, which is primarily Webster Groves, Glendale, and a part of Oakland. So that's kind of a thumbnail sketch of what we're about. And we have monthly programs, and if you sit through the whole program, you get to join us for some hospitality and fellowship, which means wine and cheese. So we always start our meetings off with the Pledge of Allegiance, so would everyone please rise. And we have Senator Eric Schmidt with us this evening. So can you lead us in the pledge?
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, we got be like Conan O'Brien or Jim Leno. We got three very fine speakers with us this evening. We got representatives of the Vacation Liberty School. Then we're going to hear from Senator Eric Schmidt about the recently completed legislative session, and we're going to end with a presentation by Bill Federer. So first ask Ann Gassel and Mary Catherine Victor to come up and speak about Vacation Liberty.
And by the way, Ann Gassel is the committee woman for Wildwood Township.
Way up.
And if she looks familiar, it was last
It was
month,
just
right?
last one. I'm just wearing a different hat now.
Well, thank you for all you do, Ann. That's very good.
Obviously, education is my thing, and several years ago, we got involved. We have a group of moms, and we were interested in education, and there was a group in Kentucky that had put together this program called Vacation Liberty School. They had a curriculum. This is around the 2010 elections, and everywhere we mentioned it to people, like, oh, that sounds really good. You guys should do that. So we said, okay. And it's a one-week program for kids in middle school, so 5th to 8th grade. It's modeled along the Vacation Bible School format in that they come for a half a day so that they're doing sports and things like that in the afternoon. They have time to do other activities. But the focus of the program is to teach these kids the founding of the country through the lens of faith, hope, and charity, which is a lens that is completely removed when they receive that message in the public school system. Faith has been totally stripped out of it, and it's very hard to understand our country's founding if you don't understand the role of faith in it. We also teach them personal liberty and economic liberty. So through games and other activities, they learn free market principles, capitalism. We have a central banker who teaches them about inflation without them realizing it. They all of a sudden experience inflation.
On the third day, they figured out inflation. They said, well, you know, we go back to the store and everything's inflated again, like right.
Yes. Because he has taken, they earn nuggets throughout the week, which have intrinsic value. They're Jolly Ranchers, so they can eat them if they want to. But the central banker comes in and he will give them paper dollars for the Jolly Ranchers. But of course, he produces 2 paper dollars for your Jolly Rancher, which means your individual dollar is now worth less than what your nugget would have been. So Mary Catherine is dressed like this because one of the things we do very early on is try and get the kids' mindset back into when the Pilgrims first came over. So they experience the tyranny of King George, and then they come to America and they experience the experiment of America. We talk about to them in classroom sessions about like Jamestown's founding and why that failed so miserably. And they play a bubble game where they have squirt guns and bubbles, and they learn about producing for yourself versus producing for the community and getting to keep the rewards of your labor. So they don't realize they're learning these lessons initially while they're learning it. They just think they're having fun squirting bubbles with their squirt guns until we talk about it afterwards, and they're like, oh, and it's wonderful to see this dawn on them. And it's wonderful to watch them play the economic games because, again, the games involve risk, and depending on how risk averse you are, you may not get as much as the other kids, but when they're all done and they count up their winnings in the games, they're much more able to accept the difference in the amounts that everybody has because they recognize the risk that went into getting the larger amounts, and they weren't willing to take that risk and get that amount. So there's kind of erases that class envy thing or that envy of the wealthy because you realize the effort that they took to get the wealth that they had. So like I said, we have a one-week program. It'll be June 24th to the 28th, and this year we'll be running it at the Family Vision Library, which is in St. Peter's. And we have online registration. There's some of these brochures in the background that have our website on it, and it's $60 for the week, and there's a family discount if you have more than one kid. And it's a lot of fun. We have kids that came the first day, and you could tell they were there because Mom made them come. By the end of the day, they're like, can we come back tomorrow? So we try and teach the message in a very fun manner. Thank you for letting us come and talk about
Well,
this.
good for you. Thank you.
Are your brochures on the
The brochures are on the back table, yeah.
It is in the You're up.
Okay. Well, thanks for having me. I apologize for my casual. You may think that because I've been in a suit day and night for 5 months, that's why I'm dressed like this. It's not. Today's my middle daughter's 5th birthday. So we had t-ball practice, and then we had pizza, and then we cut the cake, and I came, and so I'm going to go back. But I want to, obviously being gone for 5 months, she's not going to be, we were talking about this, she's not going to be hugging and kissing her dad forever. She's going to want me to drop her off far away from where she's going in a few years. But we finished on Friday, and just to give everybody an idea of the district. So this is where, I live in Glendale. So there are 2 Republican state senators that live in St. Louis County now. John Lamping is in Ladue, and I live in Glendale. Brian Diaz represents a portion of far west St. Louis County that lives in Franklin County. So my district goes from where we're at, Jefferson Township, all the way out to Wild Horse. Actually, I go all the way out to Wildwood, so Old State and Manchester. If you think about that, it's a big swath of St. Louis County, and so it's a great district. And, but obviously very proud. I used to sit up here in this on this dais here with my mayor, Rich McGee. So we had a very, very successful session. Historically, it's the largest number of Republicans that have served in the General Assembly at any one time. We have 24 out of 34 Republicans, 24 out of 34 members in the Missouri Senate are Republicans. And in the House, they have 110, which is a veto-proof majority. It's the first time there's ever been a veto-proof majority. That doesn't mean that we have veto-proof majorities on every issue, but it means that the pure numbers are there. So I was going to talk about a few things and then obviously answer any questions. The first is something that I probably spent most of my year working on. It's something I believe very passionately about, and is broad-based tax relief. Missouri ranks 48th in GDP growth over the last 10 years. We've lost half of our congressional delegation in the last 70 years, so we're not growing as quickly as a lot of our neighboring states. In my view, we've been on this path. It was time to have a bold statement and change that trajectory. And for me, tax policy is a really important thing. It's not the only thing, and it's not the only thing that matters, but it really is a critical, it plays a very critical part in whether it's personal freedom, people having more money, more of their own money to spend however they choose to do it, and also business owners, for them to be able to reinvest in their company, whether it's hiring people or buying inventory or new equipment, whatever it is, freeing up their own capital to spend how they see fit, not the government. And that's at the heart of it, quite frankly, why I'm a Republican, and why I've been a Republican my whole life, and why I was in debates in college, and why I got involved as an adult and ran for office, because I just think that people make better decisions. And so this is the largest, and I'll explain the bill, the largest fundamental change in our tax code in 100 years since we had an income tax really in our state. So what we did was we lowered the personal income tax rate by 0.5 point for everybody, and cut in half the taxes for every single business in the state over either a 5 or a 10-year period. One of the things that I've been working on the last few years is we've talked a lot about small businesses, and you have 80% of businesses out there are small businesses. But when it comes to reducing tax liability, we've kind of fallen short on a way to do that, because typically the way small businesses are organized, they're not C corporations, they're not big companies. They're flow-through entities. And if any of you have your own small business, you know what I'm talking about, they're in either LLC or they're an LLP or they're closely held. And so whatever income that business generates flows through to that individual's personal tax return. So we haven't ever figured out a way to deal with that issue so that those people who own those businesses can receive tax relief. So this is something that Kansas, for example, acted on last year. They eliminated the flow-through tax for those small businesses in 1 year. Now, you can argue that that was too quick, that it won't work, or it's the best thing in the world. The reality is, if we do nothing in Missouri, particularly on the western side of the state, where there's not a river that divides us, but rather a road like Manchester Road, to move to Kansas from Missouri, all you have to do is move your shop across Manchester Road, is the best analogy I can think of. And so if you can save 6 or 7% by doing so, people are rational economic actors. Over time, people are going to make those decisions. Is it all going to happen in 1 year? No, because people are locked into leases. But as those leases come up over the next 5, 6 years, it's my belief that people are going to make those decisions. In fact, we had testimony that the Kansas Secretary of State, who handles business, they've seen their business license applications double in the last year. So clearly, there are other states, Oklahoma, that are moving in this direction. So for us to be able to do it is no small feat, and everyone would benefit. And so for me, I was on Charles Jaco about 6 weeks ago, and of course the line was, why is this is supply side economics, it's never worked. And my point was, anytime historically you've had broad-based reduction in taxes, our economy has expanded. The problem at the federal level is they don't rein in spending, so you have deficit spending at the same time. But in Missouri, we have to balance our budget. And so I think you're going to see growth, whether it was Kennedy or Reagan, whoever proposed it, whoever did it, historically that's always been how our economy has expanded, freeing up that money for people to spend in the economy. So that was a big deal. We passed it overwhelmingly in the Senate with veto-proof majorities. The House is a few votes short, but there were a few Republicans that didn't vote that day. I fully expect the governor to probably veto this, which would be probably one of the more defining moments of his since he's been governor. He ran, interestingly enough, I had another tax cut 2 years ago that he signed, and if you remember his campaign ads, he ran on cutting taxes. It was that bill that he ran on, and so he's in an interesting spot now where he's going to have to find a way to oppose this that's inconsistent, I think, the way he ran. So that was a big ticket item. Some of the we obviously we balanced our budget. We have a $400 million surplus. So there's been a lot of tough decisions along the way in the past since I've been up there, and even before then when the economy went south. We've had to make some very, very difficult decisions. And there's a reason why we're one of 7 states with a AAA bond rating. I think it's because we've made a lot of those tough calls along the way, and we have a surplus now to show for it. There was some discussion earlier this year of the governor wanted to expand Medicaid. That never really got any traction. Part of the issue is depending on what, there's so many unknowns with this issue as far as what's included, the amount of flexibility, which is virtually zero, as far as I can tell, that states have, but also the cost. It's anywhere from $200 to $400 million a year. When we see that kind of growth, just with the current Medicaid eligibility that we have, you see almost a $200 million increase every year if you never expand eligibility. So in a term-limited world, it's very easy to make promises to people about things that you're going to do, but I think our job is to make sure that anything that we do is sustainable in the long term, and our judgment at this point was that that plan wasn't very well thought out, so that didn't happen. It never really had much of a chance this year, I would say. One thing that I'll mention that's sort of non-legislative that you may have heard about was this Department of Revenue issue. What has happened over the last 6 months or so, it's been discovered that the Department of Revenue, when you go in for it, whether it's a concealed carry permit or a new driver's license or to renew your driver's license, they've enacted a new policy where they scan your documents and retain those documents. And there's actually a company in Georgia that those are sent to, and they issue the driver's license. But none of this stuff was ever made public, which is part of the issue. I actually chair a committee called, nobody's ever heard of it, but it's a pretty important committee. It's called the Joint Committee on Administrative Rules. Anytime an agency wants to enact a new policy, they're supposed to promulgate a new rule, and we say yes or no. Well, we discovered through these hearings that when you go back 2.5 years, they made a decision that they were going to change this policy, but they never ever promulgated a new rule and came before the legislature and asked for permission. To me, obviously that's a problem, but it's also symptomatic, I think, of a larger issue, which is, we were talking about this, you have agencies now that if they're unchecked, their power can be pretty immense. We have a Department of Elementary and Secondary Education that has done a couple things over the last few years without many people noticing. One is the implementation of the Common Core standards. There hasn't been hardly any discussion or any education about this outside of the DESE kind of think tank. And then another thing that affects this area in particular is the foundation formula. The way we fund K through 12 education in the state, it's about $3 billion a year, okay, from the state. It's by far our single largest appropriation. And there's a law that says who gets what. I won't get into too much about it's for areas like Kirkwood where we fund 90 to 92% of a kid's education comes from local taxpayers. We get very little from the state, a few $100 a kid. Now, the aggregate of an entire district, it amounts to a lot of money. But in some other parts of the state, they only fund locally, say 40%. So we fund our schools, right, and then we send money to Jefferson City and it goes to those schools. So there's issues there. But regardless of what those fundamental issues are, DESE has decided, because there's not as much money as they'd like to see in the formula, without any permission or without any authority in statute, they've decided that they're going to shift around $130 million as they see fit, what they believe to be equitable. Well, that's not, as an attorney, that's not, you can't do that. You're an agency, you're supposed to execute, you're an executive branch, you're supposed to execute what the law says, and they're violating that law. And so I'm hoping, and I've talked to Dr. Williams about this, and I've talked to Special School District. Special School District, for example, in St. Louis County, which is a county-wide district, is losing out on $3 million a year. I mean, that's our money that should be coming back here, and is not. And so I'm hoping one of those districts sue. Ultimately, I think DESE will lose the lawsuit, and then we'll be back at the table drafting a new foundation formula, which is what we should be doing right now, not allowing an agency to kind of do what they want willy-nilly. So those are just a few things that happened this year, and there's a lot of things that didn't happen too, but I certainly won't leave time for questions. And Frida had her hand up.
Well, I just wanted to let you know it's time.
Okay. Oh, that's the wrap up. So
If anybody's got questions.
yes.
Did they defund DOR? What was the?
Yeah, what we did was we funded DOR enough to get to the next time we appropriate money. We don't want a situation where they're not able to issue driver's licenses, because that would ultimately affect the people, our constituents, who would be upset about that. But we're trying to send a message that, and they still haven't come before the committee that I chair, even though they said that they were going to promulgate a rule in the scanning. Now, we did pass a law, we'll see what the governor did, that says that forbids them from scanning and retaining documents moving forward.
But they're still doing it.
But they're still doing it as of right now, and I think the governor's going to wait as long as he can. There's a whole backstory. I have my own idea why this is that, but he has, I believe it's 45 days to sign or veto that bill. If he signs it, they have to stop that day. The effective date would be August 28th. If he vetoes it, then we'll be either through the rules process or try and pass something next year.
Did I hear that right, that the sheriffs are now going to issue the carry permits?
Yeah, we shifted the authority from the concealed carry permits from Department of Revenue to the county sheriffs.
So what happens in St. Louis County and St. Louis City? We don't have a sheriff.
We have a sheriff. It doesn't have the same function as a typical county sheriff, but we do have a sheriff's office. So,
They will have to figure that out.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but it won't be the Department of Revenue anymore. Yes, sir.
Would you like to discuss your bill? It was kind of comprehensive on several issues linked with amendment number 2 to the U.S. Constitution on the right to bear arms.
Second Amendment?
Oh, let's say, sure. So there were a couple. We had a lot of Second Amendment legislation this year. One was that we believe that there's a constitutional amendment that ultimately didn't get on the ballot that we'll try again next year to sort of reaffirm our right to bear arms in the Second Amendment. The other thing that we're very concerned, obviously, with what's happening at the federal level with regard to what Congress is doing when it comes to guns. And so we're just making it clear that in our state, we believe that that right is an unalienable right. I mean, it is something that is listed very specifically in the Constitution. And each state is given the opportunity to have reasonable regulations if they see fit, but we certainly want that to be a kind of a state decision. And so that was something that we spent some time on this year too.
Is it true, SJR 14, I think it was, that itself is the Second Amendment that didn't pass?
It did not pass.
That it is better if it didn't pass, it should pass next year because it has to go on the ballot?
Yeah, so any joint resolution that would put something on the ballot wouldn't go on until 14 anyway. So
Right.
whether it's this year or next year, it doesn't
But
matter.
do they have the votes next year to get that passed?
Yeah, and we did this year. What happened was, and this is the problem with it, this come down to the last day or two, time is very, very limited. And that's what ended up happening is
Right.
we sent it out of the Senate pretty early. It came back with some technical fix, much like the Common Core bill came back to the Senate. And when it comes back in the last day or two, there's so many things to get to. If 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 senators stand up and want to block it, it's much easier to do that in the second to last day or the last day than it is in April. So that's what happened. Yes, ma'am.
Is there any fracking going on in Missouri
Fracking.
for the oil?
Not that I'm aware of.
The Southern Illinois has oil.
Yeah, not that I'm aware of. One of the things, we have immense amounts of coal, and it is, so Missouri is at 80% coal. Most of our energy comes from coal, 80% of it. And so when you talk about things like cap and trade, it has a particular impact on a state like Missouri. But I'm unaware that we have natural gas reserves that we haven't really tapped into, but we don't have those same resources as it relates to crude oil. Yes, sir.
Sticking with energy a little bit, can you talk about, I guess, why the bills failed as far as large hydro counting into the renewable energy standard as well as the infrastructure surcharge mechanism for Ameren?
Hydro, I think, is an important mix into our sort of energy portfolio. It's pretty challenging with our lock and dam system. The Corps of Engineers have a lot more authority over what we can do as it relates to hydro than because of the system, the interstate commerce that takes place. As it relates to ISRIS, I opposed that bill. It was, to me, it was we have the Public Service Commission plays a really important role for consumers. in as far as checking what those utility rates ultimately are. And you had a system where we were going to, by and large, start carving out all kinds of costs that the Public Service Commission wouldn't have review of, and ultimately would have accounted to one of the biggest utility rate hikes that we've ever seen. And so you have employers like Anheuser-Busch and Monsanto that we're talking about is going to cost them $300 to $400 to $500 million a year. But more importantly, a lot of people that I represent who live down the street, we're going to see a pretty significant increase in their utility bills. Now, what Amron's argument is we have to deal with this utility lag between rate cases, which I don't deny is an issue, but that's kind of how the system is set up, so that those investments are made and then the Public Service Commission can review them and then approve them later. Right now, they've had about every year and a half, they've had a rate case. They've testified that their system is reliable. I just didn't see a need for rates to be increased for consumers, because everybody I represent is an Ameren ratepayer. It's a lot easier for a guy in Northwest Missouri who doesn't represent any Ameren ratepayers to say, "Oh, sure, we'll let they can do what they can do what they want to do." For me, when you represent everybody that pays an Ameren bill, it's a lot tougher call. But I imagine that issue will be back.
So what's the difference between like the water utilities and the gas utilities? Have the infrastructure surcharge mechanism, so why not electric?
I opposed all of them. I opposed all of them. I didn't like the gas wanted an ISRIS, water wanted it. Water has an ISRIS in St. Louis County. It has allowed, now water is a little bit different because they were legitimately dealing with cracked water mains. To me, Ameren did not make the case that we have that kind of an infrastructure problem right now. If we have that kind of thing where water mains are busted, I think what they like to do is they like to be able to modernize, which I don't blame them, and I want them to be able to modernize. But the question is the appropriate way for them to be able to do it. And I think the current system we have in place gives them an ample opportunity to do it. Yes, sir.
Amongst the 50 states, do you know where Missouri ranks as far as tax burden?
It depends on what measure you're looking at. I think if you combine, I'd say we're probably about in the middle of the pack like we are with most things. One of the things that we struggle with in Missouri is, this is a phenomenal statistic, and not in a good way. There are about 7,500 taxing jurisdictions in the entire country. 2,500 of them are in Missouri. So what that means is we have 520 plus school districts, but you can't talk about consolidation, right? It's the third rail in rural Missouri. I mean, nobody wants to have their school district consolidated. You have that, you have all the TIF districts, you have CID districts, you have NID districts, you have all of these different taxing districts laid on top of one another. And it really presents, and we're getting to a point now where our sales tax is approaching 10%. And when 80% of your population lives within 30 or 40 miles of a neighboring state, we have some challenges, I think, with a really high sales tax. So for me, I've never been one that says that the tax burden is the only thing that drives either people to come or stay or businesses to come or stay. But I do think we have to recognize that there's a changing landscape, particularly among Midwestern states, whether it's Indiana, Kansas, or Oklahoma. All of them are moving towards a lower income tax-based tax and to generate revenue. And I think Missouri, we've got to acknowledge that. So.
You mentioned sales tax. Where did you stand on the sales tax for infrastructure for highways?
I opposed it. I voted no. It was an $8 billion tax increase that I just couldn't support.
Gary, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now it's Bill Federer. He's going to entertain us for the next half hour.
Thank you, Eric. Great job. And thank you, Rich. It's a tremendous honor being here with you and Frida. I'm going to try to do something with my laptop. And there, we don't have a screen, but I was going to do a little bit of a presentation. Well,
You want me to dim the lights?
yeah, why don't you dim the lights?
I think the people, I can see it where I'm sitting.
And so I've written a bunch of books. They're on the table back there. One of the books is on the history of the U.S. and Islam, which people are finding quite fascinating. In a nutshell, Muhammad was a religious leader, then he became a political leader, and then he became a military leader. And Muhammad fought in 66 battles He even used the catapult when he attacked the city of Al-Taif. When he was told the catapult was killing innocent women and children, his response was, they are among them. So they got to be killed too. So suicide bombers today, like the Boston bomber, think it's okay to kill innocent people to advance Islam because Muhammad did. And since he is the perfect Muslim, Muslims today, they want to be better Muslims, or they want to be more devout. They want to be like him religiously, politically, and militarily. And so there's 1,400 years of track record to prove this premise. So Syria used to be Christian, completely Christian, evangelized by Paul that wrote the gospel, they wrote the letters. And Antioch, Syria, is where the name Christian was first used. Did you know that? And then Jerusalem had been a Byzantine Christian city since Constantine. Egypt was evangelized by Mark that wrote the gospel. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Mark evangelized Egypt. It was totally Christian for 6 centuries, Coptic Christian, until Amir ibn al-As invaded. Then there used to be 250 Catholic dioceses along North Africa. So everything today that is Morocco, Algiers, Tunisia, and Libya, it used to be Christian and Catholic, right? St. Augustine of Hippo was from Carthage, which is Tunisia. And then in the year 711, 80,000 Muslims crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and conquered Spain. And the Muslims fought on horseback with scimitar swords. The Spaniards were still on foot with heavy metal swords. In 10 years, they crossed the Pyrenees Mountains. They conquered southern France. And the Pope Gregory puts out a plea that anybody that could fight, please come and join Charles Martel. He was the grandfather of Charlemagne. And so Charles Martel gets 30,000 guys, and they stop the Muslims at the Battle of Tours in 732 AD, exactly 100 years after the death of Muhammad in 632 AD. So they went from Arabia to Paris in 100 years, and it was all a military campaign. Anyway, that was the first Arab Spring. The second spring was Turkish, right? The Turkish peoples convert to Islam, and they invade the Holy Land, and then they invade what is today Turkey, which used to be the Byzantine Christian Empire. So all 7 churches mentioned in the book of Revelation, wiped out by the Muslims. Ephesus, Colossae, Galatia, gone. Finally, the people, the Greek Christians, beg the West for help, and the West sends help. It's called the what? Crusades, right? 7 major crusades. There was Richard the Lionheart led the 3rd crusade. And of course, the 7th crusade was led by who? St. Louis. St. Louis was King Louis IX, the most powerful monarch in Europe. You can see him on his crusader horse on Art Hill. He's going into battle against the Muslims. Anyway, when the crusades end, the Muslims pick up where they left off, and the Muslims surround Vienna, or first Constantinople in 1453. You know what Constantinople? That's the city where the Black Sea empties into the Mediterranean. It's sort of where the East and West met. And so it was the New York, Washington, D.C. It was the capital of Europe. But finally, in 1453, the Muslims captured Constantinople, and this ends land trade to get from Europe to India and China. And so people forget Marco Polo. Remember him? Right? He went from Venice, Italy, to China in 1271. And he brought back spaghetti, coal, gunpowder, talked about the Chinese having thread from worms, silkworms, right? And he talked about the Chinese inventing paper currency. Kublai Khan invented paper currency. Marco Polo was amazed you could buy all this stuff with a piece of paper. Unfortunately, Kublai Khan printed too much of it, and the whole empire cratered. Anyway, but Europe traded with India and China, but when the Muslims attacked the caravans and trade routes, and they finally sacked Constantinople in 1453, that ended land trade. So in 1492, a guy named who? Columbus said, I know another way to get to India and China, sail west. He runs into some islands, he thinks he's in India, so he names the inhabitants the Indians. I mean, think of it. We would not ever call Native Americans Indians if it was not for Islamic Jihad. Columbus gave him the name Indians because he thought he was in India. Why was he trying to get to India? 40 years earlier, the Muslims cut off the land routes to India. Anyway, finally, the Muslims surround Vienna in 1529, and then they surround it again in 1683. But they're defeated by the Polish king, Jan Sobieski. And so the Polish begin to drive the Muslims out. They lose battle after battle after battle, until finally after World War I, the Ottoman Empire is gone. It's dismantled. France takes apart the old Ottoman Empire, Lebanon and Syria. Britain takes apart, are you still with me? Yeah. Britain takes a part of the old Ottoman Empire, Palestine and Iraq. They wanted America to take a part of the old Ottoman Empire, Armenia, And we said no, and they killed 1.5 million Armenians between 1915 and 1922. But by and large, the Ottoman Empire was gone. And so the Muslims were ruled by secular dictators. You have to remember the British Empire was the most powerful empire in the world for 2 centuries. Then America wins World War I and World War II. And so the Muslim world says, hey, the power in the world is these European, these, English and American. So they would teach English in their countries and send their kids to Western schools. And their dictators would dress in business suits, and they wanted to appeal to the West, like the Shah of Iran. I mean, they loved America, or at least they were afraid of us, or else we could at least bribe them under the table, but they were sort of satellites around our power. But then in 1928, the Muslim Brotherhood was started. And the Muslim Brotherhood said, stop trying to be like the West. We need to restore the Ottoman Empire and have it all be ruled by one Muslim leader called the Caliph. And it was just sort of a desert thing until 1938. Oil was discovered in Saudi Arabia, and the West began to pump so much money that we're financing the spread of this Muslim Brotherhood Wahhabi stuff. And then you have this effort by the Muslim Brotherhood to pull the rug out from underneath these secular dictators so that they can have the Muslim Brotherhood take over. They were aided by Jimmy Carter, who had a national security advisor named Zbigniew Brzezinski. And he said the Soviet Union is the enemy, and the communists were trying to take Iran. And Zbigniew Brzezinski said, well, let's let Iran fall into the hands of the fundamentalist Muslims. That way, it won't turn communist, and it'll be a thorn in the side of the Soviet Union. And you know what? He was right. The only problem is it created a problem worse than it solved, right? But this began this process of pulling the rugs out from underneath these dictators. So our president fires the leader of Egypt, right? He calls Mubarak on the phone and said, you're fired. Our president on his own takes out the dictator in Libya. He had no permission to do that. Congress didn't do that. And so now they were wanting to take out the dictator in Syria. Now, dictators are bad, but Muslim Brotherhood is worse. All you got to do is talk to some Christians or Jews that live over there, and 500,000 Christians have left Iraq since we pulled out. I mean, there's nobody to defend them. Anyway, so an interesting situation. The Ivory Coast, the fundamentalist Muslims are taking over all these different countries, and long story short, we left a whole lot of military assets in Libya. And our government, our president, was funneling, like we're talking 20,000 shoulder-mounted missiles, and our government was funneling these through Libya, through Benghazi, to Turkey, to Syria, to get to the Muslim Brotherhood to take out Assad. And that's when our ambassador gets killed in Libya. So, interesting scenario that we see playing out before us. But anyway, you get to learn some of that in the book, What Every American Needs to Know About the Quran, A History of Islam in the United States. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Any questions? Yes?
I was kind of reading between the lines, but did you just say that Saddam Hussein was better than what we got now?
Yes. I have talked to, matter of fact, 3 weeks ago, I was with General Sadat. He was a general in Saddam Hussein's army. He was a Coptic Egyptian Christian. And he said that Saddam had many palaces that were all staffed by Christians. Right? Now, they were second-class citizens over there, but he trusted them, where he didn't trust the others because of taqiyya. Means you can lie to spread Islam, and you lie to do their, And anyway, he said that the setting was, for Christians, very similar to in America in the Deep South after the Civil War. The Democrats passed Jim Crow laws and black codes, right? Republicans freed the slaves, Lincoln, right? And so the Republicans, after the war, were registering the freed slaves to vote, so the Republicans were called the Radical Party. And the Democrats didn't like that, and so they would pass Jim Crow's laws and black codes. And so the freed slaves had to learn how to live as second-class citizens in the South. Now, I use that analogy because that's exactly the way the Christians have to live in Syria. In Cairo, Egypt, Christians are called garbage people because they have to live in the slums and spend their life rummaging through garbage because they can't hold a job higher than a Muslim. Anyway, he said the old dynamic was that if you were a Christian or a Jew, you could survive by being the best. The best doctor, the best engineer, the best whatever. They hated you, but they liked to have a doctor take care of them so you could find your little niche in life. He says that is all changing with the Muslim Brotherhood. He says they don't kill anybody anytime. Their goal is to take over. So that's why there's this exodus of these minority Christians fleeing all those countries in the Middle East, and they're being driven out by our arms. So the guns that we're supplying to the Muslim Brotherhood to drive out Assad, they're being used against the Christians. But when we went in there, our troops went to the Christian neighborhoods and says, we're here, give us your guns. And then when we pulled out, those neighborhoods are left unprotected, and now the Muslims are just going in there and killing and raping, and just horrible stories. Having their daughters kidnapped and made into Muslim wives. Anyway, but this book is really fascinating to give a little insight into that. Again, past behavior is the best indicator of future performance. You're going to buy a cow, how much milk is it going to produce? Well, how much milk did it produce last year? So you look at the past behavior. There's 1,400 years of past behavior. Matter of fact, in the book, in the year 846 AD, 11,000 Muslims invade Rome, Italy. And they trashed the Basilica of St. Peter's and the bones of St. Peter and St. Paul. And it was after that that the Pope decided to build a wall around the Vatican City. Right? But there were whole areas of Italy where for generations there weren't any women of childbearing age because they were taken captive by the Muslims. Anyway, yes?
What do you think the message was sent by the current Pope when he made these 800 Christians saints just last week that were murdered by the Muslims?
Right.
What kind of message does that send? Do the Muslims hear that?
Yeah, in the year 1480, the Muslims were invading southern Italy, and there was a city called Otranto, and basically they took over the whole city, but there's 813 people that were stayed up in a church, and they refused to convert. And the Muslims would say, we offer you peace, all you got to do is convert to Islam, and there'll be peace. I mean, that's their offer. And so these guys wouldn't convert, and so the Muslims killed them all. And so just a week or two ago, the Pope recognized those 813 as martyrs and saints. And anyway, it sent a signal to the world that this Pope recognizes that is where the controversy is, and that basically it's an encouragement to people to keep your faith even if you're martyred. But I've talked to people that are there with the church in Rome and get some feedback, and the thin ice that they're walking on is if they make a big issue over the persecution, they're afraid that it'll cause more persecution. When the last Pope made a speech and the Muslims went out and killed a nun and killed, and so it's, but all you have to do is read about the Coptic Christians or the Syrian Christians or the Chaldean Christians, and I mean, it's heartbreaking stories. I mean, these ancient churches that have been there for centuries are being blown apart. Anyway.
I have another question.
Yes.
Why do you think our current government is supporting the Muslim Brotherhood?
Well, two thoughts. One is they want to isolate Iran. But the other thought is that they favor the Muslim Brotherhood agenda. And so basically the foreign policy of America has been hijacked. And that I've talked to guys in the military, they said they can't believe it. 10 years ago we were fighting the Muslim Brotherhood, the Taliban, and the Al-Qaeda, and now we're supplying them with our best arms and showing them how to use them. And so it's something that we need to wake up to because this is happening.
And why is the military going along with it?
Military is taught to obey orders. And so what happens is I personally see it as a consolidating. When Hitler took over, there were these old Prussian generals that were loyal, to the German people. He would one by one accuse them of infidelity or very similar to Petraeus, and they'd be gone. Another one would be gone until finally the only ones that were left were the ones that would do what he said. You read, the Roman Empire. I mean, this is a strategy that Mubarak did. As soon as he took over in Egypt, all of the generals that were not Mubarak, but Morsi took over in Egypt. All the generals that were loyal to Mubarak, one by one, they got accused of something, they're gone. When Erdogan became the new leader in Turkey. I don't know if you know the history of Turkey. After they killed 1.5 million Armenians, they got a leader named Ataturk. And Ataturk decided to secularize Turkey. He got rid of the caliph, he got rid of all the fundamentalist Muslims, and he said, let's try to be like Europe and dress in business suits. And he put the military in charge of making sure the politics would never go fundamentalist Muslim again. And it worked all the way up until about 4 years ago, when this Erdogan, who's a fundamentalist Muslim, gets elected, and then he accuses all the generals, and he has them arrested in the night, and they're gone, and so now he has his military people in charge. And so it's a change in the foreign policy. And you start naming off the people that the president has surrounded himself with. Abedin is Hillary Clinton's right-hand person. She's from Saudi Arabia, and she's friends with people that are friends with the Muslim Brotherhood. And Ali Khan was the deputy mayor of Los Angeles, and he stopped Los Angeles from tracking terrorists. He did such a good job. Now he's one of the key guys in Homeland Security. And then there's Karim Shora from Damascus. He's a fundamentalist Muslim. And then there's Rashad Hussein, who's a deputy White House consul, and he's a fundamentalist Muslim. And a friend of mine, Frank Gaffney, is in D.C. He was with Ronald Reagan. He says there's a steady stream of these fundamentalist imams that are going in and out of the White House. And it is a change in our foreign policy that's happened within the last few years. We're just beginning to wake up to it, but it's
What's their goal?
well, the Muslim Brotherhood goal is world domination. It's to have first all the Ottoman Empire restored under one caliph. They call it a caliphate, and then ultimately the Muslim Brotherhood, once their website says Allah is our goal, jihad is our way, death for the sake of Allah is our highest aspiration, and so you look at I was going to talk about something else, but my time is just about up, so I'll finish talking about this. Matter of fact, I do have a little bit I can show of this. So this is my book on Islam. Can you see that okay? And I have a little bit of a PowerPoint. So I always say we're not concerned about moderate Muslims. They're not a threat. But we are concerned about political militant Muslims. And they're the ones that, there's a Boston bomber recording. Here's they have jihad. In Dira Square in Saudi Arabia, Riyadh. They have Chop Chop Square. And so every week they chop off arms and legs. And this is their Sharia law judgment. Here's a man with his wife. It says in Sharia law, cut off the hand of a thief. And this is the guy who says, we call for a complete upheaval of the British ruling system and demand Sharia in Britain. So there's 12 neighborhoods in Britain, that in London, we're talking Birmingham, Liverpool, Manchester, that are now Muslim neighborhoods. And they want them to be independent Islamic emirates. And they put up signs saying Sharia is here, and enter at your own risk. Just like the beheading we saw of a soldier right in the streets of London. And here is the Muslim Brotherhood. This is their constitution. Allah is our objective, the Quran is our constitution, the Prophet is our leader, jihad is our way, death for the sake of Allah is our highest aspirations. Started in 1928, and this is the group that gets to come in and out of our White House. They don't like democracy, and anyway, here they started Sharia for America. So they have a plan for us. And it's interesting, it's a brilliant system. A guy practices Sharia in his house. So I was speaking in Detroit, Michigan, and after my talk, a whole auditorium full of people, I'm at the book table, and the guy says, a guy named, or Our Lady had a ministry to pregnant mothers. And so she goes to this house of a Muslim woman, and she's pregnant, and out of a room comes another pregnant mom with a kid. And out of a room comes another pregnant mom and a kid. Another room, and pregnant mom and a kid. All of them from the same man. And so in their house, they practice Sharia in the house. And then a guy comes up and he goes, oh yeah, Fazl has a house. He went ahead, because the neighborhood goes down when the Muslims move in, so the houses are cheaper. He bought every house on that little block, has a wife in every one of them, and they go down to the welfare and say, my husband's not around because it's okay to lie. And so they get welfare. And so he says all the kids that play in the streets are all his kids, just by different wives. And it's all being paid for. And so they take over first the house, and then the block, and then they take over a neighborhood. and then they take over a little community. And since we have a democratic form of government, they vote for their mayor and sheriff and everything, and now they've got the Muslims in there. And so it's a brilliant system, and so people move out. And it goes back to Muhammad's life. And let me see if I can find this one little slide here. So the religion of Islam is okay. Do I agree with it? No, but as long as they're just doing it personally of themselves, it's fine. But political Islam is not okay. When they want to take over laws, take over neighborhoods, and they have penalties for not obeying their laws. So what's happening? And we look at history. So we got the 3 different springs. This is the world 20 years before Muhammad was born. It's all Byzantine Christian. And then it's attacked by the Persians, and they beat each other up, and so Islam fills the power vacuum. And Muhammad, there was all these different faiths that were there before he came along, pagans and Zoroastrians and Jewish and Christians, and lo and behold, when Islam, he sort of combines those different things. So the most popular god in Mecca was the moon god, and they had this rock they thought fell from the moon, and they'd kiss it and walk around it, and so he kissed it, and so that got incorporated into his belief. Zoroastrians believed in genies, and that got incorporated into Islam, and Zoroastrians believed that paradise was filled full of virgins, so that got, put in there. Anyway, Muhammad couldn't read, which isn't uncommon. The UN Development Fund says 30 to 40% of people in Egypt today cannot read. So Muhammad and his followers couldn't read. So the word Quran means recitation. It's all an oral thing. And there's the Jewish, but he couldn't read their Old Testament, so he heard their oral traditions called Talmud and Mishnah. And then there's the Christian faith. And even Encyclopedia Britannica says the gospel was made known to Muhammad through apocryphal and heretical sources. So Muhammad thought the Trinity was the Father, Mary, and Jesus. Nobody explained to him the Holy Spirit. Anyway, I can go on and on, but let me get to one slide here. So, Muhammad is in Mecca for 12 years, and he only makes 70 converts. And he's hanging around that Kaaba, trying to make converts, and these pagans are happy being pagans, and so they're not converting. Then he gets new verses from his Allah telling him to warn the infidel of judgment. So now he's a little bit more confrontational. And the pagans in Mecca consider this as disturbing the peace. And so they decide to chase Muhammad out of town in the year 622 AD. So this is year 1 in the Muslim calendar. Our year 1 is the year Jesus was born, or as close as they can get figure to it. The Muslims' year 1 is 622 AD, the flight, when Muhammad was chased out of Mecca to Medina. So he flees to Medina. Now Medina was a Jewish city. 3 Jewish tribes controlled Medina, and they were nice enough to let him in as an immigrant, a refugee. He presents his faith, but they rejected. And so he goes into the minority neighborhoods in Medina, and he begins to get a little following, and he goes back to the Jewish leaders, and he presents himself as a new kind of politician, that he's new to the city, he can rise above their partisanship, and so the Jews make a treaty with him, and so now Muhammad is a political leader as well as a religious leader. Then something happens. Muhammad's followers in Mecca, they get a little pushy, argumentative, and threatening, the way some of his followers are today. They get chased out of town for disturbing the peace, and so they flee north to Medina. And Muhammad permits them to rob the caravans headed to Mecca in retaliation for the Meccans chasing them out of town. And so where Jesus said, if they take your coat, give them your shirt, Muhammad said, if they take your house, take their caravan. So retaliation. And so Muhammad has 300 warriors, and they would rob the caravans. He had a whole chapter of the Quran revealed to him by Allah on how to distribute booty from robbing caravans. And so in the year 624 AD, the Meccans send 1,000 soldiers to protect their caravan, and Muhammad with 300 defeats 1,000. It's called the Battle of Badr. And this amazing victory, having been outnumbered 3-1, convinces Muhammad to be a military leader. And that's when he fights in these 66 battles, and he even used the catapult when he attacked Al-Taif. And so, Muhammad was a religious leader, a political leader, and a military leader. Sort of RPM, in your car, revolutions per minute, right? So, yes, Islam is a religion, but it's also a political system, and it's also a military system. So a mosque is a religious building, a political building, and a military building. And bowing to Mecca is a religious bowing, and a political bowing, and a military pledging of allegiance to another capital. And it's impossible for them to split the religious from the political military because Muhammad was all three. And he's the perfect Muslim. So there are Muslims that are peaceful, but they would be more or less considered backslidden. They just want to live their life, But the fundamentalist ones that want to be like him, they end up doing all three. Anyway, in the year 627 AD, the Meccans send 10,000 soldiers to Medina, and Muhammad, his idea of roadside bombs was he'd done potholes and trenches all around the city, which rendered the superior cavalry of the Meccans useless. So you show up with your 10,000 horses and camels, but the field's full of potholes and trenches, you can't charge, they'll break their legs. So it throws off their battle strategy. So Muhammad goes to some of these pagans and he bribes them and they slip away in the night. He goes to some of the other pagans and he threatens them and they slip away in the night. Sort of the Chicago politics, the bribe or the bullet. And then it gets freezing cold for a week and the Meccans lose heart and decide to bring their troops home. And when the Meccans retreat and bring their troops home, instead of Muhammad becoming peaceful, instead he's emboldened that his enemies were cowards and they could not subdue him. So he goes back into that Jewish city of Medina, and remember those 3 Jewish tribes that let him in 5 years earlier? He gets offended at one of the tribes, confiscates their property, and chases them out of town. Gets offended at the second tribe, confiscates their property, and chases them out of town. Now this actually set a precedent in Islam called hudna, which is their word for treaty, which means when you are weak, you make treaties until you get strong enough to disregard them. So when Muhammad first came to Medina, he was weak. He was chased out of Mecca, and so he was weak, and that's when he made the treaty. Now it's 5 years later, he's strong, chases away the Meccans, and so he breaks these treaties. Now that third Jewish tribe in Medina, he bottles them in their neighborhood for 25 days. When they finally surrender, he brings them into the market, and he chops off their heads. 600 or 700 of them, and then he sells the women and children into slavery. And so slavery is the #1 way that Islam was financed for 1,400 years. When you spread something with the sword, what do? You kill some people, but what do you do with the ones who surrender? You sell them. So the Muslim Arab slave markets, and they enslaved 180 million Africans in the 1,400 years of Islam, castrate the men, make them eunuchs, sell women into the sex trade, and they captured over 1 million Europeans. Entire Italian coasts captured by the Muslims. All the cities had moved upland into the mountains. Greek islands, Spain, France, Portugal. I mean, they carried thousands away. One of the pilgrim ships was captured by the Muslims. You know the Pilgrims, Thanksgiving, you know Squanto, right? In 1625, the Pilgrims had saved up 800 pounds of beaver skins. And they have a ship going back to England, and a Turkish man of war captures it in the English Channel, takes it to Morocco, sells the crew into slavery. In 1630, around there, the Muslims capture an entire Irish village, the stolen village of Baltimore, Ireland. They come up at night, kill some people, they round up the whole rest of the town, take them to Morocco, sell them into slavery. Around 1637, they capture 400 from Reykjavik, Iceland, round them up, take them to Morocco, sold them into slavery. And so there were entire Catholic orders in Europe in the Middle Ages called Trinitarians, and they would ransom back your friend who got kidnapped. And so the head of the order was called the ransomer, and they would collect alms and donations across Europe and use the money to go back and ransom. One of the famous guys they ransomed was Miguel de Cervantes. And when he went back to Spain, he became a writer. And what did he write? Man of La Mancha, Don Quixote. Anyway, so they had slavery. So within 5 years of Muhammad coming into Medina as an immigrant refugee, within 5 years of him coming into the Jewish city, there's not a Jew left in the city. They were either chased out, killed, or enslaved. And so we see this 3-step process. Immigrate, increase, eliminate. So he immigrated as a religious person, increased the number of his followers and got involved in politics, and then he eliminated militarily the previous culture. And so, sort of like Caesar's 3 steps, Veni, Vidi, Vici, I came, I saw, I conquered, Muhammad's 3 steps was immigrate, increase, and eliminate. And so we see this happening in Europe. That drive into reverse. Europe used to be all Judeo-Christian, right? Catholic, Protestant, Reformation. Then, of course, every city had a Jewish neighborhood called a ghetto. They were not allowed to live anywhere else. They had to stay in their neighborhood. But Europe was, for all practical purposes, 100% Judeo-Christian. Now, they didn't always live up to it. They had terrible wars, but they had these verses bothering their conscience. We're all made equal in the image of a creator and doing to others as you would have them do unto you. And so, as faulty as they were, nevertheless, Europe went from that to neutral, to secular, with Robespierre and the French Revolution. So Robespierre put the prostitute in Notre Dame Cathedral, said this is the goddess of reason, let's worship her. And then they behead 40,000 people in Paris and killed 300,000 in the Vendée. and they wanted to get rid of all Christianity. So they didn't want a 7-day week with the Sabbath rest, so they made a 10-day week. They didn't want done in the year of the Lord, so they made 1793 the new year 1. They said 10 was the number of man, 10 fingers, 10 toes. That's where they came up with the metric system. Maybe that's why I never really liked the metric system. Anyway, but Napoleon spreads this French secularism all around Europe. So Europe went from Judeo-Christian to secular, and then secularism says, hey, nothing special about the Christian, Judeo-Christian past, bring in whatever you want. So into Europe comes all these new beliefs, everything's sort of fine, and more and more and more come in, until finally Sharia law Islam comes in, slams the car into reverse, and now they're beginning to take over. So Europe's very socialist, the government pays for their healthcare, welfare, and retirement. Am I talking too fast? And they're having fewer kids, plus abortion. So the Europeans are like, who's going to work the jobs to pay the taxes to support all these retirees? I mean, they have 5-week vacations every year. I mean, it's so socialist. And so somebody has a bright idea. Let the immigrants in. They'll work the jobs that'll pay the taxes and support all these social programs. Well, now they're finding out 70% of immigrants in Europe are Muslim, 50 million of them, and they're having on the average 8 kids per family. Now they're finding out that they're the #1 group signing up for welfare in every country. And so now the Europeans are financing their own Islamification. And so Europe is going from Judeo-Christian to secular, now it's becoming Islamic. And so we see in Germany, the chairman, Angela Merkel, said in the beginning of the 1960s, our country called for foreign workers to come to. And he says, we kidded ourselves for a while. We said they won't stay, but this isn't reality. The approach to building a multicultural society has failed, utterly failed. So 10% of Berlin is now Turkish Muslim. Kreuzerplatz, I mean, all these neighborhoods are now Muslim. And then in France, there's 751 neighborhoods taken over by Muslims. They call them zonas urbanas sensibles, sensitive urban zones. And the police just give up. They have signs saying, don't, you go in there at your own risk. You know, you think, how did they take over these 751 neighborhoods? Immigrate, increase, eliminate. The first ones came in as immigrants, and they were nice, and they were genuinely nice, and they were so nice, people said they're nice. Let more in. More come in, and they gravitate together. Normal. They get a little community, then they get an imam, and the imam says, okay, now that we're here, start following the Quran closer. Ladies start wearing the burqas, and don't eat the haram food, just the halal food, and they become more visible. And as they become visible and pray in the middle of the street, people think, you know, my neighborhood's changing, I'm going to move out. And then more Muslims move in, and then those that refuse to move out, that's when violence takes place. And there's no witnesses, because no Muslim will dare testify against another Muslim on behalf of a kafir infidel. If they did, they'd get in trouble. And so they can do these crimes and there are no witnesses. And so what happens is that people move out and the neighborhoods transition from French to the secular to Islamic. And then we see in Belgium, 20% of Brussels is now Muslim, and Mohammed is the #1 name given to newborns in Brussels and in London and in Milan. And Italy, you know, they have the largest mosque in Europe is there. The Netherlands, they have 40 no-go zones in Holland, and the firemen refuse to show up to put out a fire unless they have a police escort, because the Muslims will pelt them with rocks while they're trying to put out the fire. And anyway, most of southern Holland is now Moroccan Muslim. And anyway, here's the Dutch interior minister saying the Dutch government will distance itself from the relativism contained in a model of multicultural society. In Sweden, 25% of Malmo, Sweden is now Muslim. And the #1 crime in Norway, Sweden, and Denmark is what? Rape. Muslim immigrant men raping European women, because Muhammad permitted the men to rape the women they took in battle. So here's November 7, 2011, newspaper says, rape epidemic in Norwegian girls, direct result of Muslim immigration. Back in May, it was reported that every rape assault in the city of Oslo in the last 5 years had been committed by a person of a non-Western background, a Norwegian euphemism for Muslim. Anyway, so it's a brilliant strategy. You come in as a religious person and take advantage of the freedom of religion, and then you begin to increase your numbers and make a political impact, and then you begin to eliminate the previous culture, and then you establish Sharia law. And so there's 1,400 years of this that we can see. I'm going to skip past a bunch of stuff. It's all in my book and my DVD on the table back there. All right, let me just show you just a couple maps just to make it interesting. This is Muhammad's sword, by the way. It's still in Istanbul. Here's his general, Khalid ibn al-Walid. He was undefeated in 100 battles. He was called the Drawn Sword of Allah. And so here they captured Jerusalem, and they captured Egypt, and they captured Syria. And let's see here. This is a dream. Within 23 years of Muhammad's death, they captured the Ghasanids, who were Arab Christians. Yemen was a Jewish kingdom. Syria was Christian. Jerusalem had been a Byzantine Christian city. Armenia was Christian. All of Egypt was Christian. And then they went into Persia. And then the 250 Catholic dioceses along North Africa. Then they invaded Spain, Sicily, Corsica, Sardinia, Rhodes, Crete. And this was the largest political military empire in the world. Within 23 years, lightning fast. Why? Because he harnessed very powerful human motivations. In other words, you ride into town and you tell the men, if you join us in jihad, your debts are canceled. If you're a slave, you're free. You get women. If you die, you get more women. Oh yeah, and if you don't join right now, we'll kill you. And so you got your positive and your negative motivations. And anyway, and so that was, and so then they invade Spain. It took 700 years to drive them out of Spain. Here's El Cid, Charlton Heston, Sophia Loren in the movie. Right? He was one of the Spaniards that helped drive the Muslims out of Spain. They finally drove them out in 1492. And they had slavery in Africa, as I mentioned. And there's the Zanzibar coast was the Arab slave trading posts. And it was all throughout the Ottoman Empire. There's more slavery today than at any other time in world history, and a whole lot of it is in Muslim countries. And then they finally conquered Constantinople in 1453. And this is an interesting point. So the word Islam means submission to the will of Allah. A Muslim is one who has submitted to the will of Allah. And in essence, the word Islam means the opposite of freedom and liberty. So in America, we're like really big into freedom. Eat what you want, dress the way you want, go to the church where you want. Islam controls all of that. It dictates it for you. So Islam is a religion of peace. And they think there will be peace when the whole world submits to the will of Allah. So in other words, to them, world peace means world Islam. So when we think of peace, we think of different groups getting along. When they think of peace, they think of everybody submitting to the will of Allah, and there's peace. And now a moderate Muslim thinks the world will submit to Allah later. Maybe it's at the end of the world. Maybe it's figurative. And since it's so far in the distant future, just live your life and have your kafir infidel neighbor. Fine, they can live in a free democratic society. The fundamental Muslim thinks the world's going to submit to Allah now. They're really excited. They want to help make it happen. Now the dilemma for us in the West is the more we bend over backwards in unprecedented ways to show ourselves tolerant, the more the moderate Muslim begins to rethink. Say, wait a second, maybe the world is in fact submitting to Allah now rather than later. I mean, here you have Harvard shutting down its gym so they can have Muslim gym practice, and we have the university, we have all this promotion of Islam. In other words, our foreign policy has been like in football. We say, if we can just let them get 10 yards and a first down, they'll get nice, and they'll let us get a first down. Well, that doesn't work, so we say, well, let them get a touchdown. Then they'll be nice, and they'll let us get a touchdown. We let them get a touchdown, they're playing harder, so we let them get another touchdown. They're playing, pretty soon we keep giving in to them, and now they're packing out the stadium, and they're getting excited, thinking they can really win this thing. And we're like, gee, why aren't they letting us get a turn? And we don't understand that mentality. Anyway, then we got the Crusades, and let's see here. There's St. Louis. See, there's St. Louis on his Crusader horse. And this is all the world that they controlled. And Tamerlane, you know the bomber? You got bomber in Boston. You know what his name was? Tamerlane. Tamerlane killed 17 million people. A Muslim descendant of Genghis Khan. In Samarkand, Uzbekistan, and all across. And they would take the boys from the Christian families and make them into slaves. And then they would be their little boy lovers, you know. Talk to soldiers, they'll tell you about man-boy love Thursday and all that stuff. Because Friday's their boss day. Anyway, and then this is interesting. Here's the last Byzantine stronghold. It's called Constantinople. And now the Muslims are now on both sides, the Ottoman Muslims. what are these other colors? Well, those are Greek and Venetian and Genoan, and they're merchants. And so the Venetian and Genoan merchants are selling military goods to the Muslims that they know is going to be turned around and used against the Greek defenders of Constantinople, but they don't care, they want a buck. And so here you have financial interests in the West betraying the West just for some money, right? And that's a whole other dynamic that we see happening. So finally, this was the largest cannon in the world. Mehmet II was the Muslim leader. He used Western military, a cannon maker defected and worked for him, and they would melt the church bells down into cannons. This was the largest cannon in the world. 27 feet long, could shoot a 1,200-pound stone cannonball over a mile. But he was using Western military technology against the West. So it's like Mahmoud Ahmadinejad in Iran using Western nuclear technology to build bombs against the West. And anyway, when they finally conquered Constantinople, it cuts off the land trade routes, and that's when Columbus set sail to find the sea route to India and China. And anyway, Martin Luther starts the Reformation, and then finally you have 100,000 Muslims surround Vienna, and the battle. You know, the third oldest church in St. Louis, Missouri is Our Lady of Victories, to celebrate the victory of the Battle of Lepanto in 1571. It's the largest battle ever on the Mediterranean Sea. 230 Muslim ships powered by Christian slaves under the deck, rowing for them like Ben-Hur. And there was the Holy League, one of the few times that the Genoans and the Venetians and the Dutch and Austrians and everybody fought together. And anyway, 15 minutes before the battle, the wind changes directions to favor the Holy League. And so they win, and they defeat and capture 200 of the 230 Muslim ships. So this breaks the back of the Muslim Ottoman Navy, and so the Pope went ahead and declared at a feast day, Our Lady of Victories, and that's what the church is named after, in downtown St. Louis.
The statue was broken down here, wasn't it? About a year ago, they broke the head of the statue.
Really?
It didn't make big news.
Wow.
The priest, pastor talked about it.
Wow. Anyway, I better quit. But it's all in the book, and I didn't even talk about this book, but this is I spent a year researching every civilization on planet Earth, and found out there's 6,000 years of world history. 4,000 BC is right around when writing was invented. And so the most common form of government in all of recorded human history is dictatorship. Pharaoh, Caesars, Kaisers, Sultans, and Czars. So that's the default setting. What's rare in history is people getting a chance to experiment with ruling themselves without a dictator. And so you had Israel under the judges for a couple hundred years, but then the rubber band snaps back and they get King Saul. And then you have Athens for about 200 or 300 years as a democracy until Alexander the Great's dad conquers them. And then Rome was a republic until Julius Caesar made himself dictator for life. And all these attempts to stretch the rubber band and give the power to the people, they always end up snapping back. You know, there were some Italian city-states and Swiss cantons until Napoleon conquered them. You know? But America, we took the power of King George III and separated it, but after every crisis, we see this gradual reconcentration of power back into the default setting. But anyway, I'll quit.
I read a stat just the other day that said only 5% of the world's population has experienced living under freedom. Does that sound
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
That seems so low to me.
And dictatorship is still today, it's called communism. So in every communist country, the leader of it is a dictator, right? So Stalin, Pol Pot, Ho Chi Minh, Castro, Mao Zedong, King Jamil, you know? And then the Communist Party members are the new royalty. They get to live in the nice houses, they get special shops to shop in, they get special treatment before the law, and then the people are the peasants. So we still have the dictatorship, we just call it a different name, but in effect, it's exactly the same. So we still have concentrated power, and then try to separate it, but rubber band snaps back. America, because of our Judeo-Christian morality, is able to have the best and longest attempt at separating power and people under self-control. But as we get rid of our faith and virtue, people give into their passions and lusts, and there's more violence. And we say government step in to restore order, and they do by concentrating it, and it goes back in the hands of the dictator. But anyway, it's also in times of crisis that leaders rise up. So whether it's a Moses, David, or a Washington or Lincoln. Yes, sir?
As much as I love the history, could you jump ahead to the 21st century United States?
All right.
Where does Barack Hussein Obama?
Well, he's surrounded himself with what I've identified as 3 groups of people. People associated with the Muslim Brotherhood agenda, people associated with a socialist communist agenda, and people associated with a atheist, gay, lesbian, moral type of agenda. And so it's sort of a hybrid of these different things. The one thing, though, that they all have in common is they don't like the traditional Judeo-Christian values that were at the founding and the history of our country. So we do see that what Teddy Roosevelt called the bully pulpit. So just by his preferences, just by who he hangs out with, just by who he invites to have a beer with at the White House, we see that it is people that fall into those 3 categories. That there very few people that would fall into the the category of strong traditional faith. And then so I can go on that. But you've been so kind, and there is some snacks back there. But I'll be glad to hang around my table and answer any questions. And
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much. This was very educational, Bill. Thank you.
I think that in times of crises, leaders rise up. And so I'm praying that we get some good leaders